Kazakhstan just signed away 100,000 barrels per day. Not to Europe, not to the United States, to China. And the payment currency is not the US dollar. That single decision represents more than oil moving through a pipeline. It represents Central Asia choosing a financial system, an economic orbit, and a sphere of protection that does not include Washington. Every time a barrel of Kazakh crude crosses into Chinese territory and gets paid for in yuan instead of dollars, the architecture that has kept American power afloat since 1974 loses another brick. And most Americans have no idea this is happening. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. The analysis that needs to happen about what Kazakhstan and China just demonstrated is not happening on mainstream platforms. It is happening here. Subscribe if you want the full picture. Turn on notifications because the next phase of this shift happens faster than the first. Here's what actually happened. On March 14, 2025, Kazakhstan's state oil company Kazmunagas signed a memorandum of understanding with China National Petroleum Corporation to expand the capacity of the Kazakhstan-China oil pipeline by an additional 100,000 barrels per day, starting in the fourth quarter of this year. The official statement described the deal as a routine infrastructure upgrade to meet regional energy demand. The press release was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned cooperation, mutual benefit, and sustainable development. It did not mention the currency structure. It did not mention the geopolitical realignment this represents. And it definitely did not mention that this pipeline expansion is phase 2 of a broader strategy to decouple Central Asian energy exports from Western financial infrastructure. The Kazakhstan-China pipeline already moves 200,000 barrels per day from the Caspian region into Western China. The expansion brings total capacity to 300,000 barrels per day. That volume might sound modest compared to global oil production of 100 million barrels per day. But volume is not the story. The story is direction. The story is currency. The story is what happens when a country that sits on 30 billion barrels of proven reserves decides that its energy future flows east instead of west. Now here is what the official narrative leaves out. Kazakhstan has spent 2 decades walking a careful line between Russia, China, and the West. Its geography makes neutrality a survival strategy. Russia sits to the north. China sits to the east. The Caspian Sea and Iran sit to the west and south. For years, Kazakhstan exported oil in multiple directions to avoid dependency on any single buyer. Crude flowed west through Russian pipelines to European markets. Crude flowed east through the China pipeline. Crude moved south by tanker across the Caspian to Azerbaijan and onward to global markets. This diversification was deliberate. It was insurance. But something changed in the last 18 months. Western sanctions on Russia closed off the European route as a politically safe option. Insurance companies refused to cover shipments. European buyers quietly stopped renewing long-term contracts with Kazakh suppliers whose crude transited Russian territory. The United States made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that energy partnerships with Moscow carried reputational and financial costs. So Kazakhstan faced a choice: reduce export volume and lose revenue, or find a buyer willing to ignore Western pressure and pay in a currency that does not require access to the SWIFT banking system or approval from Washington. China made an offer, not just to buy the oil, to build the infrastructure that makes the oil flow east permanent, to denominate payments in yuan, and to provide the financial backing that insulates Kazakhstan from Western economic coercion. That offer did not come with democracy conditions. It did not come with human rights clauses. It came with cash, construction, and certainty. Let me show you the technical structure of what this actually means. The Kazakhstan-China pipeline runs 2,800 kilometers from the Caspian coast to Alashankou on the Chinese border. It crosses some of the most remote terrain in Central Asia. The expansion adds pumping stations, storage terminals, and metering infrastructure that costs approximately $2 billion. China is financing 80% of that cost through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and direct loans from Chinese state banks. Kazakhstan contributes the remaining 20%. In exchange, China gets guaranteed supply for 25 years at a price indexed to Brent crude, but paid in yuan. Here's where it gets important. Paying in yuan means Kazakhstan must either hold yuan reserves, convert yuan to other currencies, or spend yuan within the Chinese economic system. All 3 options reduce dependence on the US dollar. If Kazakhstan holds yuan, it needs access to Chinese bond markets and yuan-denominated financial instruments. If it converts yuan, it uses currency swap agreements that bypass dollar intermediation. If it spends yuan, it buys Chinese goods, services, and technology. Every scenario moves Kazakhstan deeper into a financial ecosystem where Washington has no leverage. The official story says this is about energy security. The operational reality says this is about financial sovereignty. Kazakhstan looked at what happened to Russia after 2022 and drew a conclusion. Any country whose revenue depends on access to Western banks, Western insurance, Western shipping, and dollar clearing systems can be economically decapitated overnight if it steps out of line. The solution is not to never step out of line. The solution is to build revenue streams that do not require Western permission to function. Now here is what almost nobody in the Western press is saying plainly. This deal does not happen in isolation. Turkmenistan signed a similar agreement with China in January 2025 to expand natural gas exports through the Central Asia-China pipeline. Uzbekistan agreed in February to settle trade with China in yuan and rubles instead of dollars. Kyrgyzstan joined the Chinese payment system for cross-border transactions. Tajikistan signed a memorandum on yuan bond issuance to finance infrastructure. In 6 months, every former Soviet republic in Central Asia has taken at least one step to reduce dollar dependency. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. The pattern that matters is this. China is not asking these countries to abandon the West. China is offering them an insurance policy. Keep your Western partnerships if you want. But when those partnerships become politically complicated or economically dangerous, you have an alternative. That alternative comes with infrastructure funding, market access, and a payment system that operates independently of institutions controlled by Washington, London, or Brussels. Let me show you what the Pentagon is not telling you and why their silence is louder than anything in their public statements. The United States has spent 30 years treating Central Asia as a logistics corridor and a resource zone. American engagement in the region spiked after September 11th, when military bases in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan supported operations in Afghanistan. Those bases are gone now. American diplomatic presence has shrunk. Economic engagement is minimal. The United States imports zero oil from Kazakhstan. Trade volume between the U.S. and Kazakhstan is $4 billion annually. Compare that to China-Kazakhstan trade volume of $31 billion annually. The United States talks about partnership. China builds pipelines. Here's the dimension the State Department does not want to admit. The United States has no counteroffer. Washington cannot compete with Beijing on infrastructure financing because Congress will not appropriate the funds. American companies cannot compete on pipeline construction because insurance costs and sanctions risks make projects unviable. The U.S. cannot offer an alternative payment system because the dollar-based system is precisely what these countries are trying to reduce exposure to. So the American strategy is to complain about Chinese debt traps, warn about loss of sovereignty, and hope that fear of Beijing keeps Central Asian governments aligned with the West. That strategy is failing. The evidence is in the contracts. The evidence is in the pipelines. The evidence is in the currency denominations. And the evidence says that Central Asia is recalibrating toward the power that showed up with financing, built the infrastructure, and asked for oil in return rather than political alignment. Now let me show you the math that explains this entire shift better than any diplomatic analysis. China consumes 15 million barrels of oil per day. Domestic production covers 4 million barrels per day. That leaves an import requirement of 11 million barrels per day. Roughly 70% of those imports transit the Strait of Malacca. The U.S. Navy controls the Strait of Malacca. In a crisis, the United States could blockade that waterway and choke off China's energy supply within 96 hours. That vulnerability is unacceptable to Beijing. So China is systematically building overland import routes that do not transit choke points the U.S. Navy controls. The Kazakhstan pipeline delivers 300,000 barrels per day after the expansion. The Russia-China pipeline delivers 800,000 barrels per day. The Myanmar-China pipeline delivers 200,000 barrels per day. Total overland imports from these three routes: 3 million barrels per day. That represents 12% of China's total import requirement. 12% might not sound like much, but it is 12% that cannot be blockaded by the United States without invading sovereign territory. It is 12% that flows regardless of what happens in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. And it is 12% that grows every year as more pipeline capacity comes online. Now look at the cost comparison. The Kazakhstan pipeline expansion costs $2 billion and delivers 100,000 barrels per day. That is $12,000 per barrel per day of capacity. Compare that to building liquefied natural gas import terminals and tanker fleets that remain vulnerable to interdiction. Compare that to the cost of securing sea lanes across 9,000 kilometers of ocean. China's paying a premium for geography. It is paying to move the choke point from the ocean, where the United States is dominant, to the land, where China has every advantage. Here is the asymmetry that matters. Every barrel that flows through the Kazakhstan pipeline costs the United States strategic leverage. It does not cost Washington money. It does not cost American lives. It costs influence. And that cost is not measured in budgets or defense appropriations. It is measured in the slow erosion of the ability to shape outcomes through economic pressure. Sanctions work when the target needs access to your system. Blockades work when the target depends on routes you control. When the target builds alternative systems and alternative routes, those tools stop working. And the United States is discovering that you cannot rebuild leverage you already spent. The replacement rate is the killer. The United States is not building new tools of economic coercion faster than adversaries are building ways to avoid them. China adds pipeline capacity every year. Russia develops new payment systems. Iran perfects sanctions evasion. North Korea survives total isolation. Every success story of resistance teaches the next country how to insulate itself. Meanwhile, American power operates on the assumption that the world still needs access to systems Washington controls. That assumption gets tested every time a country like Kazakhstan signs a deal denominated in yuan and pays for with a pipeline the United States did not build. Now pull back from the immediate energy deal and look at the geopolitical chessboard this move sits on. China is not just buying Kazakh oil. China is constructing a sphere of influence in Central Asia that pushes Russian dominance back and fills the vacuum American disengagement created. For decades, Russia treated Central Asia as its backyard. These were former Soviet republics. Russian was the common language. Economies were integrated through Soviet-era infrastructure. But Russia is distracted. The war in Ukraine consumes resources, attention, and credibility. Moscow can no longer offer the economic inducements or security guarantees that kept Central Asian governments oriented toward Russia. China saw the opening. Beijing is not trying to replace Russian influence entirely. That would provoke Moscow unnecessarily. Instead, China is becoming the indispensable economic partner while allowing Russia to maintain nominal political influence and security arrangements. It is a careful division of labor. Russia provides security. China provides development. And Central Asian governments get what they actually need, which is roads, power plants, and export markets, without having to choose sides in a confrontation they want no part of. Watch how China structures the relationship. Kazakhstan gets pipeline capacity, infrastructure financing, and market access. In return, China gets oil, political alignment on issues Beijing cares about, and a deeper integration that makes future decoupling economically painful. But the agreement does not include military bases. It does not include formal alliance commitments. It does not force Kazakhstan to pick China over Russia or China over the West. Beijing understands that Central Asian governments will tolerate economic dependency as long as it does not come with visible sovereignty costs. So China gives them the money and lets them keep the flags. Russia is watching this shift with mixed feelings. On one hand, Chinese infrastructure investment stabilizes a region Russia no longer has resources to develop. That stability serves Russian interests. On the other hand, every Chinese pipeline, every yuan transaction, every signed agreement pulls Central Asia incrementally out of the Russian orbit and into the Chinese system. Moscow recognizes the trend, but Russia cannot compete economically with China. And opposing Chinese investment would push Central Asian governments toward the West, which Russia sees as a worse outcome. So Russia acquiesces. It adjusts. It accepts a junior role in a region it once dominated because the alternative is losing influence entirely. Now look at what this means for the United States. American strategists spent the last 30 years assuming that Central Asia would remain divided between Russian security influence and Western economic engagement. The assumption was that these countries would seek balance, play great powers against each other, and avoid becoming dependent on any single patron. That assumption is breaking down. China is offering a package the West cannot match: infrastructure, markets, financing, and political protection from Western pressure, all without the governance demands or human rights conditions that come with American partnership. The loss for Washington is not immediate. It is cumulative. The United States does not need Kazakh oil. American energy independence means Central Asian crude is irrelevant to domestic markets, but American global power depends on the dollar remaining the primary currency for energy transactions. Every oil deal denominated in yuan instead of dollars weakens the structural demand for dollars. Every country that builds yuan reserves instead of dollar reserves reduces the ability of the United States to finance deficits by printing currency the world has no choice but to hold. The petrodollar system has been eroding since China started signing yuan-denominated oil agreements with Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Kazakhstan joining that list accelerates a trend that started years ago but is now reaching critical mass. Here is the timeline that matters. In 2020, less than 2% of global oil trade settled in yuan. In 2023, that number reached 7%. In early 2025, estimates put yuan-denominated oil trade at 12% and rising. The inflection point comes when a critical mass of producers and consumers decide that holding yuan reserves is not just viable, but preferable. That shift is not happening because yuan is stronger than the dollar. It is happening because the political risks of holding dollars, the sanctions risks of using the dollar system, and the coercion risks of depending on dollar access now outweigh the liquidity advantages the dollar once provided. Kazakhstan choosing yuan is one more brick out of the foundation. It is not the brick that collapses the structure, but the structure is not collapsing all at once. It is eroding, and every time a country with 30 billion barrels of oil reserves decides that its financial future points east instead of west, the erosion accelerates. What burned into the contracts signed in Astana is not just an oil deal. It is the recognition that American economic dominance has a ceiling. That ceiling is defined by the willingness of other countries to keep playing a game where the United States writes the rules, controls the referees, and changes the scoring system whenever it serves American interests. The number of countries still willing to play that game is shrinking. Here are my 3 predictions, with a clock attached. First, within 6 months, at least 2 more Central Asian countries announce yuan-denominated trade agreements with China for commodities or manufactured goods. This is not speculation. The infrastructure is already in place. The only question is timing. Second, by the end of 2025, total yuan-denominated oil trade reaches 15% of global volume as Saudi Arabia expands its yuan contracts and more producers follow Kazakhstan's example. Third, within 18 months, the United States attempts to counter Chinese influence in Central Asia with a new infrastructure initiative, but the funding falls short and the initiative dies in congressional negotiations. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first? Another Central Asian yuan deal, Saudi expansion of yuan oil sales, or an American counteroffer that actually gets funded? Tell me, because I read every single one. If this gave you a framework that mainstream coverage did not provide, if this showed you how oil deals in Central Asia connect to the slow unwinding of the financial architecture that has kept American power dominant for 50 years, share this with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. The next video goes somewhere, even this one did not reach. Subscribe so you are there when it lands.